Good morning. Thank you all for joining us. I'm very pleased to see the room is nearly full. This is a session that I very much look forward to. We'll be focusing on the ITF Transport Outlook 2023. Now, as some of you may be aware, the Outlook is a publication that we bring out every 2 years. So the last one was 2021. The next one will be published at the summit in 2023. So we're in a little bit of a between year right now. But the work is already underway, so what we would like to do is use this session as an opportunity to have a policy discussion about those policy measures that we include in the modelling exercise that we will do for the next Outlook. So the focus of the discussion in this session will particularly take into account the perspective of the next theme, which will be a just transition to sustainable mobility, although there was also interest expressed in infrastructure and livable cities. So, the structure for today's session, in a moment I'll invite Jari Kappala, our head of unit, to come and give official opening remarks, but then that will be followed by a presentation from my colleague Melithi Fernando, who was the project manager for the ITF Transport Outlook 2021. Melithi will talk us through some of the pertinent outputs from that report and lessons learned that may be relevant for discussion going forwards to Outlook 2023. We're also joined by 4 distinguished speakers who will then join us for a panel discussion and offer their perspectives on the different measures and theme for the next Outlook. So with us today we have Sonal Shah, who is the founder of the Urban Catalysts and also the executive director of the Centre of Sustainable and Equitable Cities. Sonal brings experience of working across India, Asia, the Middle East, Africa and the USA. We're also joined by Neil Pedersen, who is the Executive Director of the Transport Research Board, or TRB, and he provides direction and leadership to TRB's technical activities and also brings with him 29 years of experience in the Maryland Department of Transport. We have Clarisse Cunha joining us as well. She is the Brazil Director for ITDP, and she also has previous experience with the Bicycling Empowerment Network in Namibia, and is formerly a board member of the SlowCat network, as well as having academic pursuits. And finally, we're joined by Mohamed Hegazi, who is the founder and director of Transport for Cairo, and he is also working with the UNFCCC Climate Champions with a focus on decarbonising transport, working on Africa and towards COP27 this winter. So that's a brief overview of what you will hear this morning. I will now invite Jari to give his opening remarks, and then that will be followed directly by Melithi's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ola, and good morning, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all to this session on ITF Transport Outlook. My name is Jari Kappala. I'm head of the ITF Secretary General's office. This session, which is dedicated to the ITF Transport Outlook, I'm specifically happy to be here in Leipzig, in person, seeing, after 3 years of absence, seeing so many new colleagues, but also some very old friends, and really, really nice to be meeting you all again. As many of you may know, the ITF Transport Outlook is our flagship publication. I do carry it all the time with me. It is in my bag. It's a bit heavy, and I hope that the next edition will be a little bit thinner, so it's less to carry with me. And the latest edition, as mentioned, was indeed launched 2021, so the last May during our virtual summit. The Outlook itself presents long-term projections for transport demand and related CO2 emissions under alternative policy scenarios that are designed in collaboration with our experts, member countries, stakeholders, and you today in this audience as well. These scenarios are based on our in-house transport models that cover all modes of transport, freight, passenger, at the level of global, national, and even at the level of every single city in the world. For us, the ITF Outlook at the ITF, it really is a strategic tool. It helps us to analyze how the world could change if we choose different policies and implementation pathways. And I think now, more than ever, there is really a need for such type of an assessment. We are seeing dramatic challenges ahead of us, not the least for the transportation sector. But despite these challenges and uncertainties, we must not lose the sight of our vision for transport's future, which is economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable transport. And the transformation towards that vision should start now, if we really are going to meet, for example, our climate goals. But it doesn't need to only start now. This transition to sustainable mobility, it needs to be just and fair, leaving no one behind. And that is indeed why our next Outlook will be focusing and will be published here in Leipzig and at the next year's summit, will focus on just transition to sustainable mobility. To us at the ITF, Outlook is also a discussion starter, but at the same time it's also a call for action, and this time a call for action for transition to that sustainable mobility. So today's session here, to us, and I hope for you as well, it really is an opportunity to share the experiences of our excellent panel that we have here today, experiences around the world, and gain new insights on how this transition to sustainable mobility can and should happen. I'm very grateful to our speakers, a very diverse panel representing the different regions in the world as well. It's excellent for joining us today, and I really look forward for hearing your perspectives and the discussion with the audience here today. But first, to set the scene, as mentioned by Ola, I will give the floor to my colleague, Maliti Fernando, who will give an overview and the lessons learned from our previous Outlook to set the really scene for our discussions today. I hope you will enjoy the rest of the session, and I really do hope that you participate in the debate very actively. So thank you very much, Maliti. Floor is yours. I leave the Outlook.
Thanks, Yari. Good morning, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Maliki Fernando, and I was the project manager of the last edition of the Transport Outlook, which we launched last year. It's my pleasure to share with you some key findings that should hopefully lead into the conversations that we're having today about the upcoming Outlook 2023. First off, sorry, let me just get my PowerPoint slides in order. Great. I think we're up. Okay, excellent. So let me just skip over to... So to first off, give you a little bit of background about the Transport Outlook project. The ITF Transport Outlook started back in 2008, and it's been part of this 2-year cycle since 2013, and it's part of the OEC's official Outlook series. It provides the latest output of our global models, which are being continuously improved, and there's a theme for each edition. It's kind of a lens with which we analyze our outputs and present our results. Previous themes have looked at accessibility in cities, trends in developing economies, transport disruptions, and lastly, as Yari alluded, perhaps the most important role of this outlook is to be a conversation starter, to spark collaboration with governments, with industry, with academia, and create opportunities for discourse like we have today. The 2021 theme focused on how we can create more equitable social outcomes while transitioning to more environmentally sustainable transport. And of course, given the context at the time, it was looked at from the lens of COVID-19 recovery and possible scenarios under that kind of uncertain stage. Our results, I should note, are available for download on the OECD Stats database, as well as resources and summaries can be found on our website. Each Outlook evaluates demand, emissions, and other indicators for transport under different transport policy scenarios. The 2021 edition looked at 3 different ones that represent 3 different levels of ambition when it comes to decarbonizing transport. So the first one, Recover, looked at a return to our current policy trajectory. And what I mean by the current policy trajectory is where would we be by 2050 if governments followed through on all the commitments and kind of plans that they had made prior to the pandemic after the pandemic. So they kind of reset their course and got back on track. So it's not a do-nothing scenario, but it's not a do more than what was planned scenario. Reshape offers a completely different trajectory. We assumed here that coming out of the pandemic, governments would be transformational in their commitments and focus on green recovery, going far beyond their pre-pandemic promises. And then in Reshape Plus, we identified opportunities to leverage things such as travel behavior change that we saw during the pandemic, or the stimulus packages that might be available today as a result, to boost some of the policies that we recommend in Reshape to front load their implementation and kind of achieve our goals a little bit faster. We'll start off looking at the current trajectory. This is where we expect transport to head if we continue with our current trends. This is the result of our recover scenario. Starting off with demand, under our current level of policy ambition, we expect the demand for transport activity, both in passenger travel as well as the movement of goods, so freight, to more than double between 2015 and 2050. Much of this growth in passenger and freight transport is driven by population growth and economic growth and increasing prosperity and quality of life around the world. This is compounded to a certain extent because the areas of the world where we're seeing the greatest population growth is where economies are rapidly growing as well. As more and more people around the world newly have the ability and the means with which to travel, it brings up this big question of how do we meet this demand sustainably and ensure that people have access to the opportunities that they need? And then also, is all this demand necessary? And we'll come back to that. Meeting the demand under our current kind of technology trajectory and our current policy ambition means that the transport sector by 2050 will emit 16% more greenhouse gas emissions than 2015. And this would, of course, overshoot the level that we need to maintain to have a chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees by about 3 times. You can see that with the yellow line. I want to draw your attention in particular to the growth in emissions in the non-urban passenger transport sector. So this is what happened, the travel that happens outside of cities or between cities, and the freight sector as well. We do not currently have the strategies and technology in place to even stop the growth of emissions, let alone reverse the growth. Now, before we move on to what we need to do, I want to take a moment to consider where these emissions are coming from. This graph shows the per capita transport emissions by world region, ordered from the region with the highest GDP on top to the lowest GDP on the bottom. The correlation is quite significant, as is the fact that the lowest emitting regions are the ones that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so we don't want this to be simply a downer here, but the good news, of course, is that the highest emitting world regions are the ones that have the capital and the technological means to take a really meaningful leading role in reducing emissions. So now, moving on to a more optimistic picture. How do we move from where we are to what could be possible with strong commitments and follow-through action? When we launched this publication last year, we presented these 6 high-level policy themes that were woven throughout the publication. Today, I want to, in the light of our summit theme and the discussion around the upcoming Outlook, I want to focus on these 4. Number 1, increasing ambition, aligning policies, focusing on accessibility, and supporting innovation. So first off, raising ambition. We know that if we don't set goals, we're not going to achieve them. So this is where the NDCs come in, this is where government commitments come in. This graph shows clearly that if we continue on our current trajectory, the dark blue line, we are not going to hit the reductions in CO2 emissions that we need by 2030 and 2050 that would be compatible with limiting global warming. With the high ambition and follow-through action that is needed from the reshape scenario, we have a chance of just about meeting these targets. It's the line in the middle in the lighter blue. And then the reshape plus scenario helps us reach these goals faster and with greater certainty, reducing CO2 emissions by 70% by 2050. But this higher ambition, it does look different depending on where we're talking about. All countries cannot implement the same actions. There are a number of local and regional characteristics that we need to take into account. At a very high level, and this is a warning, this is a macro level analysis here, if we consider the patterns in OECD countries and non-OECD countries, We can observe some general patterns in regions with more developed economies of the OECD and the ones that are experiencing rapid economic growth at the moment. The slide here is showing you demand and emissions per capita for passenger travel in urban areas. On the right-hand side, you see the demand graph, and on the left-hand side, you'll see the emissions. The solid lines here are the current trajectory, and the dotted lines are most ambitious scenario, or V-shaped plus. You can see that demand and emissions per person are much higher in developed regions. But moving forward, if developed regions reduce their current very high levels of demand for transport by identifying where there's travel in excess of what is necessary, this means reversing the unsustainable patterns of sprawling city growth, reducing reliance on private cars, and then developing regions, they cannot reduce their growth on average, because as we mentioned, as people improve their quality of life in a way that allows them to access places that they may not have been able to afford before, or where infrastructure or services may not have existed, we can't simply reduce demand. However, by leapfrogging the patterns of the developed economies that are now trying to undo these patterns, developing regions really could leapfrog and focus on this different ideal. Looking at mixed-use communities that don't design for the private car to begin with, a focus on shared and clean mobility. And paired with these measures plus others, if this was to happen, emission rates in these two kind of macro regions may actually converge, as you can see on the graph on the right. Now, this leads us to actually implementing policies, and what do we need to think about? The results and recommendations that we make throughout the Outlook strongly advocate for environmental ambition paired with COVID-19 recovery policies, because we need our economies to recover, and we need more equitable systems than we've had before. We know that within countries, inequality is growing, economic inequality. We know there are discrepancies in emissions, in access to transport, or access to opportunities as a result of access to transport, and COVID-19 has simply exacerbated some of these issues. The only solution that we see moving forward is to align these actions and interventions to make sure that they're cost-effective, that they are appealing to the public. We've seen what happens when they're not, and allow us to achieve these goals much faster. One of the most important ways to align these goals and achieve these ambitions equitably is to move from a focus on mobility to a focus on accessibility. And what I mean by that is accessibility-focused policies ensure that people have access to opportunities, to goods, without putting the focus on traveling more and traveling faster, which is what we would traditionally call mobility-focused policies. These are the policies to encourage denser neighborhoods. You're probably familiar with the 15-minute city idea that's regained popularity recently. The idea is for you to be able to work and send your kid to school, shop, meet your friends, and all within kind of a smaller radius. And if you do need to go somewhere else, having multimodal solutions that fit your individual needs so you can get there affordably, depending on the type of trip that you're doing. Some of us may have gotten a glimpse of this during the pandemic if we were able to walk and cycle and go to the grocery store that was in our neighborhood. Others of us did not have this as an option. The supermarket was too far, or we weren't able to meet friends in a neighborhood park. And the idea is, wouldn't it be more equitable, wouldn't it be easier simply and more inclusive if we all had the opportunity to access these destinations closer to home while reducing our transport activity? This is very different from the private car-centric model that we have used in decades past, which leads to building wider and more roads and inducing more and more car traffic. It takes into the account the needs of people who cannot or choose not to own a car, and it ultimately makes it more affordable as well. These principles do apply to freight as well, moving from long supply chains and the focus on faster transport to consolidating our loads, maybe not going for the next day delivery, pickup points in urban areas, for example. Lastly, I want to talk about technology and innovation. It is true that we absolutely need to shift away from our current fossil fuel-based technologies. And in order to do so, we do need more technological development to decarbonize the transport sector. But we need to ensure that the conversation around these flashier topics remain grounded in the reality that new technology is not a silver bullet and can very easily overlook the needs of wider populations. We need to invest in developing new fuels and vehicles, and we need to focus on making them affordable and available quickly. We need to adopt digitalization to create more efficient systems, but we need to keep in mind who has access to these technologies. Clean mobility cannot be a luxury. The benefits of these extend way beyond CO2 emissions, looking at the local benefits to air pollution, noise pollution, and so on. We need to encourage their adoption through financial incentives and investing in public charging infrastructure. It's crucial, though, that we target high use and shared vehicle fleets, such as delivery vehicles, public transport, or shared mobility, so that the greater public can reap the benefits that these new technologies provide. Lastly, we've mentioned that all regions need to decarbonize, but there is a difference in where the capital lies. We need to ensure that these technologies and capital are available to all through technology transfer, fair global funding mechanisms that are developed in partnership with developing countries and regions that address the social and economic priorities of these regions as well. And apologies, I think I missed my slide there. Oh, okay. That's the slide you missed. I'm going to move on, though. So, in closing, I want to draw attention to what we talked about today. The Transport Outlook 2021 recommended that we increase our ambition, taking into account strategies that depend on the local context, align our economic recovery with decarbonisation initiatives and those to create more equitable societies. And we can achieve this by focusing on accessibility rather than simply more travel. And lastly, ensuring that we support innovation that keeps equity at the center, and that we strive to improve technologies while making them affordable and accessible worldwide. These 4 recommendations, I think, are particularly relevant to the summit theme on transport for inclusive societies. And as we launch into our discussions today, I look forward to hearing our panelists' take on some of these issues. Thank you very much. Orla?
Thank you very much, Malithi. And if we could have the second presentation, please. So in order to move forwards from that, as I'm sure you got the impression from Malithi's presentation, there are a great many policy measures that are considered in our global models for this work. And so to try and focus or set the scene for our discussion, I'm just going to talk you through about 4 groupings of measures to give you an idea of the types of things we consider. So first up, a grouping of measures that will focus on improving vehicles and fuel technology. And this would include the types of measures that would aim to increase uptake or improve the availability of less polluting vehicle technologies and lower carbon fuels. And of course, encouraging users to choose these vehicles over the more polluting ones that are already on the market. Second grouping of measures would look at tax reform and pricing. So these would be measures that would aim to change travel choices and to manage demand through pricing and through tax measures. Alternative modes, this is quite a broad one. So this would include measures that would look to improve availability, accessibility and attractiveness of sustainable alternatives. So this could include investing in alternatives such as walking and cycling infrastructure, such as the public transport network, but also land use planning measures which make those modes more feasible for your day-to-day activities. And finally, technology and innovation, which we heard in yesterday's pre-summit research day, and again, as Malithi flagged in her notes there, it's not a silver bullet, and some of the measures that are considered are still definitely open to debate, but it would include measures which would be intended to improve efficiency and convenience and therefore attractiveness of sustainable operations and alternatives to, for example, the personal car. So these are just some of the types of measures. I wanted to give you some broad overview of the types of angles that we consider when we're discussing our policy scenarios for the modelling exercise for Outlook. But as Jari said in his introduction, the key question that we want to explore in today's session is the real-life context for those measures. So for these and other policy measures aimed at decarbonising transport, what is the policy narrative? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges of actually implementing them beyond a modelling exercise? And so for that, I would like to hand over to our panellists, who will also be joined by Malithi, to offer their thoughts on the different approaches to decarbonising transport. Thank you very much. Okay, great, the mic is on. All right, so thank you all for being here this morning. Sonal, I would like to invite you to maybe give your thoughts first, if you would please, and then we will, I think possibly you can use the yellow microphone now. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Orla and the ITF, for inviting me here today. And it was very nice that Malithi also set the context of the previous Outlook, because then that gives me certain avenues to link it to the forthcoming report, which also focuses on just transition. I think what I'm going to do is make some opening remarks focusing on decarbonization and just transition, and also happy to also talk about maybe in follow-up questions on, once we've had these numbers and ambitions, what are the roadblocks to implementation as well. So building on some of our work on gender and gender equity, I think I'm going to pick on one thing, which is what you don't measure, you don't see, right? And I think while we do have scenarios and estimates at the national level, for me as an urban planner who also works at the city level, one of the questions to really ask is, if we were to see per capita emissions by gender, what would we see? And we would see, for a large part, that and by women, of course, there are differences across age and income, but let's stay with gender for a moment. We will see that currently women's modes of transport are actually more sustainable than men's, right? And this is one thing. The second thing is that if we combine social and environment measurements, let's understand this. In some cities in South America, women are a majority of public transport users. In some cities in South Asia, they're about 30% or so, right? Sexual harassment and safety is such a big issue. What if we were to ask this question? How will safety impact the use of public transport for women in the future? And how will improving safety then result in the reduction of CO2 emissions? Because what it does is it prevents women in the future, and by their families as well, to shift to private modes of transport. And I think that when we have these kinds of measurements together, we may also move action on some of the social goals that are linked to our mode choice, for example. A second one, and I think I'll quote, I'll draw some research from a report it's called Get On Board, published in 2020. It was based in the UK, where they measured the impact of poor public transport accessibility on labor market outcomes, right? And I'll just take 2 points over here. They found that close to 1 million people in the age groups of 15 to 64 had some impairment, who were either looking for work or who wanted to work but were not looking for work, right? And they found that about 13% had either missed a job interview or were unemployed due to poor public transport accessibility. Can some of these measures, and one last point, they also estimated that the exchequer would benefit with £900 million due to reduced social benefits and increased taxes if, for example, rail became more accessible for persons with disabilities. This kind of tells you multiple things, right? How do we link environment, social, and economic goals through very concrete measurements? I will also now want to highlight two aspects very quickly. Is when we talk about just transition, and the focus was on workers who would be impacted as we transition to a low carbon or zero carbon economy, what if you're not even visible? If women are only 20% or less than 20% of transport workers, do we need to talk about just opportunities, right? Where do they find a space in very concrete ways in this narrative? And I'm going to share one example and then also come to low emission vehicles. We are seeing that there is therefore a need to document and find ways to rapidly scale up initiatives that have partnerships with government, with the private sector, civil society organizations that are undertaking smaller pilots to increase women's participation. So let me give you an example. In the east, in the state of Odisha, which is in East India, the state government is actually working with self-help groups of trans persons to first improve solid waste management in the city. While this was a first attempt, they moved to maintenance of public works, etc., right? So there was a concerted effort in order to work with organizations representing formally, if you may call, marginalized groups, and involving them. So this can clearly be a learning for the transport sector. We are seeing another example of this in the southern state of Kerala, where the Metro Rail Agency partnered with a women's self-help group. The last piece that I will talk about is particularly related to low-emission vehicles because it's such an important priority. While there's an emphasis on prioritizing commercial vehicles, a key question to ask is these vehicles are also assets, right? Just as property is an asset, etc. And we are seeing that there is, particularly in talking about India, for example, very limited focus on gender. And our own assessment in the state of Delhi found that when we conducted a gendered analysis of male and female paratransit drivers, they're called electric rickshaws, it's a three-wheeled, we found that on one hand, the trip lengths that women were, the route lengths that they were operating on were 43% shorter than the men's. They were working 30% fewer hours than men's. And they had 25% fewer passengers. Why? Because of two things, a safety, household, and care tax. And yet, if I am I'm privileged, but if I'm a lower income woman, and if I'm going to obtain a loan or a subsidy, we are giving men and women the same subsidies, when in fact we need targeted approaches. So it's going to stop here. I hope I've not taken too much time. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And very important points about the intersection between transport and different other policy objectives. Excuse me. Neil, would you like to give your thoughts, please?
Sure. Thank you, Orla. And good morning, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to see so many people interested in this very important topic. So I'm perhaps going to be a little bit provocative here. Very early in my career, I used to do these type of forecasts, but more at a metropolitan level than a worldwide level. And I was in a public meeting one time trying to defend some forecasts that we had done. And a very wise person in the audience said to me, "There's one thing that I can guarantee about your forecast. It's wrong. I don't know if it's high or if I don't know if it's low, but I can tell you it won't be exactly what you're forecasting." And that's always the danger of single point forecasts as well. So in trying to do a little research for this panel, I decided to see what comparable studies had been done on a worldwide basis. And perhaps the most authoritative one that I found is by an organization called the International Coalition for Clean Transportation. The executive director, Drew Kojak, is actually a member of the TRB Executive Committee. And I'm going to give you just a few alternative numbers to what you heard from Maliki, because their forecasting, we actually even have a bigger challenge than the 2021 forecast said. So just to set some context, they said that in 2020, 43% of transportation CO2 emissions came from light-duty vehicles and 2- and 3-wheelers worldwide. 34% from heavy-duty vehicles and buses. 11% from marine transportation. 10% from aviation, and 2% from rail. So why do I give that as a context? Well, if 34% are coming from light-duty vehicles, an awful lot of the conversation that is taking place regarding the challenges that we have for decarbonization have focused on passenger transportation. And it must focus on passenger transportation. I totally agree. But those numbers say we probably have a bigger challenge in terms of looking at goods movement and looking at particularly diesel vehicles that are used, or aviation as well. And I think that any forecast for the future in terms of addressing decarbonization, and I would argue that that is the fundamental issue that we need to focus on in order for us to ultimately have a just and sustainable transport system. We must be focusing on emissions of goods movement. Second point is that they forecast that 90% of the growth in CO2 emissions, and by the way, they were forecasting a larger increase in CO2 emissions by 2050 than your forecast as well. They forecast a 60 to 75% increase in CO2 emissions if we just continue current trends with current policies. So actually a considerably higher forecast in emissions. And they said that in order for us to achieve the 1.5 degree centigrade goal that we all have, that we would need to be reducing CO2 emissions by 78% from 2020 levels and 88% from projected 2050 baseline levels. So just let that sink in a little bit, an 88% reduction that is required, and what we are going to need to do to try to achieve that level of reduction. They also forecast that 90% of the growth in CO2 emissions between now and 2050 is projected to occur in 4 areas: China, the Asia-Pacific region, India, and Africa. And these are the areas where they are trying to achieve economic growth, obviously, very, very rapidly developing areas. So the challenge is, how can this part of the world achieve their goals in terms of economic development and economic growth, while at the same time preventing the type of CO2 emissions that are being forecast, especially if 90% of them are forecast of the increase in those particular areas. Now, I would posit all of the strategies that Orla outlined in her slides are very, very important. We need to be focusing on all of those areas. But if we're to achieve an 88% reduction in CO2 emissions, we must be focusing first and foremost on the conversion to non-CO2 emitting vehicles. And that needs to be a worldwide priority in terms of how do we make that transition? How do we do it in a just manner? How do we do it in an equitable manner? But it needs to be a world priority in terms of making that transition take place between now and 2050. I have a lot of additional comments I can be making, and perhaps will during the course of the discussion as well. But I would posit that that needs to be the highest priority in terms of our ultimately being able to achieve the just transition to a sustainable future that we've all been talking about.
Fantastic. Thank you, Neil. And I would just point out that we don't believe we hold a crystal ball on this either. So our projections in the modelling exercise are one of a range of inputs on this topic and look only at our specific policy scenarios that we consider. But thank you very much for highlighting that. It is an important point. So Clarisse, I would like to now invite you to make your comments, please.
Great. Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Orla, and thank you, ITF, for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in this panel. I'm a little bit shocked after what Neil has shared here with us, so let's see if I manage to bring some inputs. When I was, I of course agree all the points that the policy guidelines that Orla presented are super relevant, super important, and I just try to I would try to bring some lens to them, in particular considering how to make it just, how to make it inclusive, in particularly considering the reality in the Global South is radically different from what we have in European and North American countries. So I think related to the tax and pricing mechanisms, and I would like to tag that to the alternative modes policy guidelines here, tax reforms and pricing strategies must really be designed to ensure equitable outcomes across socioeconomic groups. I think no method is inherently equitable or inequitable, and instead equity can be achieved or not through careful, thoughtful design decisions, right? So in Latin America, for example, debating pricing measures for the use of automobiles at this point requires a lot of caution, and we need to know how we're going to move with this. In Brazil, we have experienced decades of incentives for purchasing of cars, motorbikes, and simultaneously, seriously disinvestment in transit. So for example, Curitiba and Rio de Janeiro, two very well-known cities with the best transit coverage in the country. Each city has only 32% of the population living near transit. It means 68% of the population in these places live far from transit, right? 85% of the population in Rio lives far from bicycling infrastructure. So the reality is that, in particular, when you go to the urban fringes, where you have the lower income population living, we have a desert of opportunity, we have a desert of infrastructure. The 15-minute city is really not a reality now, right now, in the metropolitan regions in Latin America, in Brazil for sure. We were talking in the previous panel, we have the 2-hour city. We have a 3-hour city in a crowded public transport system. So the lower income population who has migrated to private vehicles in these last 2 decades are going to be impacted by pricing mechanisms, okay? We need to move with the adoption of fee-based approaches, but we need to understand how to do that in a way that we increase the mobility of the vulnerable populations and not, on the contrary, reinforce the social spatial inequality that we already have in our cities. So I think we need to couple these approaches with really solid policies towards investing in public transportation and active transportation, but particularly in this 2-hour city, public transportation that serves longer distance trips, and of course, bike and pedestrian infrastructure that can really reinforce centralities and help us move towards this 15-minute city dream. We need to make sure that revenue from any pricing fee-based approach is linked to transport funds. Transport funds are not even a reality in many cities, right? I mean, it might sound a little bit awkward to the majority here, but many cities in Brazil don't have a transport fund. And any revenue is not necessarily ear-tagged to sustainable transport. So we need any funding, any revenue coming from pricing to be linked, mandatory to transport fund, to be ear-tagged to sustainable transport. Securing this cross-subsidy is really a crucial measure to make pricing measures redistributive policy, and I think this is crucial when we're talking about extremely unequal countries, like Latin America is the most unequal continent in the world, so worth reminding that. And I think also it's important to remember that many cities have a lot of dispute in terms of agenda. So for example, Rio de Janeiro, one of the most important cities in Brazil, only 46% of the population has sewage treated. Okay, are you shocked with this information? Yes. So there is a big competition for funding, and we need to ensure that any new revenues that come, we manage to allocate it for transport, not saying we shouldn't have funding for sewage, but I mean, these are competing issues, and the cross-subsidy here is absolutely crucial. On the second point, I think I would like to talk a little bit about technology and innovation. We live in exciting times of fundamental technological change. However, and again, it goes back to this shocking awareness about the difference between countries. What is regarded as some phases of the past industrial revolutions have not yet reached much of the global south, right? So we have many people who live without the sewage, electricity, clean water, housing, and the discussion around digitalization, I think it's great, and many of us now are really embracing digitalization of urban transport. How is that going to move, and how we're going to advance the avoid and shift proposal through digitalization. But many countries don't have the infrastructure in place for that, right? So I think countries with better digital infrastructure will make the most out of it. They are already making the most out of it. I mean, we are here, we see how it works, but we have many diagnoses on, for example, Latin American countries that show that the digital infrastructure remains they are not in place. So countries are unprepared to adopt the solutions proposed by the digitalization, right? CAF indicates that Latin America invests 4 times less in digital infrastructure than OECD countries. So I think the same as the pricing debate, we need to see how to move with these agendas in a way that we are not reinforcing inequality. And then finally, I think I would like to comment on the vehicles. And I would like here to make really the strong case, I mean, not to say all the other vehicles shouldn't be moving towards electrification or to clean technology, but I'd like to make the case for buses as really a priority. I am concerned when I see a lot of emphasis on clean vehicles, like on private clean vehicles as a redeemer of the environmental impacts. And we have seen the private sector really embracing, right, this narrative, this discourse, but not changing the business model. So we are still talking about individual trips rather than collective trips, and still talking about vehicle circulation in terms of planning rather than people's circulation. And I often mention the ITF Lisbon case, right? I think it's or used to be at least, a quite famous case to emphasize the need to combine the clean vehicles with share modes and to say, okay, it's urgent that we dramatically reduce the number of cars that are needed for the daily trips, and that we cut emissions, but also free up space. And I think when we think about buses, like by nature, the share mode, we understand also that buses are a very important way to deal with this, to have social outcomes. Although automobiles and motorcycles are the major polluters in cities, particulate matter released mainly from diesel buses is really more harmful for people's health. Buses are responsible in Brazil for more than 50% of local emissions, and they account for 86% of the trips. Right? And the more dependent the population is on the transport service, the greater the exposure to all the silent and harmful toxicity that we have coming from buses. So we have children, because of their respiratory system, they breathe up 4 times more polluted air than an adult. They are also the same height as the exhaust pipes. We have the elderly, due to the low immune system, are more prone to have the consequent diseases from polluted air. In the Brazilian case, we have the low-income population, normally is the black population who lives in the periphery and are also more dependent on the transport system and more exposed to trucks and to buses as well. So all the historically disadvantaged of more vulnerable groups are really exposed to the vehicles we have now. And I think if we push for buses as the priority in terms of urban mobility for the electrification or the transition for clean vehicles, we managed to address many of the social problems that we have in our society. So I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Clarisse, and I think an important reality check on many of the measures that are considered. So thank you. So I'm now going to invite Hegazi to make his comments, and just to let you know, we'll then be moving to questions from the floor. We do have a roving mic, so if you want to be considering your questions while Hegazi is speaking, we'll start taking them straight afterwards. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Where do I start? Where do I begin? I think that most of it has already been said, and said very eloquently and very well. I'll try to focus on the purpose of the session, which is the Transport Outlook, which is basically the model, and what does the model tell us? And I fully agree with Neil, models are wrong. I do them for a living as well. But I still like models. Think about it. Elon Musk, not a big fan of the guy, but he's rich. And I think that part of why he's rich is that he gets basic physics and he gets basics formulas. And the physics are energy density multiplied by battery of the weight. And the formula is the prices of both going down, and that's Tesla. And he saw that 15 years ago and started working, and now he's one of the richest people in the world. And this is what a model can give us. It gives us insights into the things that affect the future and allows us to affect the future by understanding their results. So a wrong model is not a bad model, it's still a useful model. And I think that that's my focus on today, because when I look at decarbonization, I put it in a very simple formula. It's not me, it's actually research that said it, I'm just reciting it. And it's basically distance traveled multiplied by vehicle energy efficiency, which is basically heavy vehicle, small vehicle, efficient, inefficient, multiplied by fuel. And this is where diesel, petrol, but also electricity comes in. Electricity is a different fuel. It doubles efficiency immediately. And divided by vehicle occupancy rate, which is basically the dividend of buses versus single individual cars. So if you play with any of these 4 variables, you get different emissions. And I'll come to that in a moment, because I think that the second formula that I really want to focus on, and this one is less present in the literature but evolving, is that of transport justice, or that of accessibility. I would define accessibility as, again, travel distance multiplied by the system. And the system is a function of many things and many complexities and many regional differences. To keep it very simple, very quickly, it's geography. It is are the stops well located or not? Are the routes take me where I need to go or not? It's time, frequency, travel time, etc. It is capacity. Do I have a seat or is the bus full? And it's price. Can I even afford it? But again, accessibility is distance multiplied by system. And when we talk about transport justice, it all falls within the system. But this then takes me to the transport model and the transport outlook, because the thing that I really think is lacking, and where I have the biggest disagreement I can have, is we cannot reduce demand. Oh, we can, and we must. We don't have an option. Because demand is also a function of distance. Yes, people will want to travel. Yes, more travel is more economic growth, and more economic growth is more travel. It's a dual-way function. But if you measure travel in terms of kilometers traveled and not trips taken, this is an issue, because you can travel and reach your destination with a shorter trip. And I think that in the both functions that I mentioned, this is the big one that we haven't talked about, which is distance traveled. Now let's go to Africa for a moment. Africa is urbanizing before industrializing, and this never happened before in human history. Industrialization came first, and then cities in Europe and the States. And Asia, it's kind of happened both in parallel. Industrialization in China drove urbanization. In Africa, it's the other way around. Countries are still not industrializing at the speed that their urbanization is progressing. So once you understand that, you also see that there's a lot of research showing how cities are growing far larger and far more distributed because of the lack of money, the lack of industrialization, than they otherwise would be. Case in point, yours truly. When I grew up, I went to high school. It was 3 kilometers away, and I went by bus and then by taxi, private taxi, because it was cheaper than the school bus. And I learned how to bike when I was 20, missed opportunity, but it would have been a brilliant route to bike. So, when I entered university, it was suddenly 37 kilometers far. That's a factor of 12. And a year later, my parents moved to the other side of the city, and these are the new urban communities that we're building, and my travel distance home university became 70 kilometers. And then I just went back to my old house. But anyway, you see that this is something out of my control, but very much within the control of policymakers, which is the travel distances that we do, the urbanization policies that we have, and what the model is supposed to tell us. And the model will tell us more travel distances is more emissions equals we need to fight travel distances. And listen to this number. 2/3 of the built environment in Africa hasn't been built yet. There are 1.4 million citizens in Africa today, estimated to grow to 3.1, I think, or something of the sorts. And it's the fastest growing. And they will all want to travel more. Yes, we cannot reduce their demand to travel, but we can and must, and the models has to say that, how to reduce travel demand in kilometers and not in number of trips. And this takes me to the second point, and I really love what you mentioned, which is what we don't measure, we don't see. And there is a lot of that we don't think to measure, particularly when it comes to the emerging countries part of the models. I had a little bit of a look behind the hood, and I emphasized with it because this is what I do for a living. And maybe what I believe here very strongly is that justice can be computed and justice can be designed through care. And this is what we also see in the formula, because having public transport that reaches your place of living is justice. Having it at the time when you need it is justice. Not having a barrier preventing you from using it, such as harassment, is justice. And these are things that all can be collected, quantified in data, computed, and then affected through targeted policies. But this requires a lot of data. And I know a thing about that, because in my other job, Transport for Cairo, over the last 8 years, we started a company that collects data to create models. And because we work in Africa in data-sparse environment, we had to learn and optimize, starting from zero, all the way through the final policy recommendations. Because the data is simply not there. And this is a big gripe of mine. There is no funding for that. And I think that this is another thing that the model needs to say and the Outlook needs to say explicitly. We have heard, and we will continue to hear a lot, we need more data, but this is not good enough. We need to get a level deeper. We need to say, what data do we need? What does the quality of that data need to look like? What will it help us compute? What will this computation allow us to achieve and change through targeted policies? And this needs to be prioritized because there is far too much money being spent on data. Neil, if you look at the sample sizes we work with in Africa, you'd probably assassinate me or something. But we do what we have to do, and it's not good enough. That's a fact. And also, I have like a friend in the audience here who will help introduce us to private investors soon to pitch our business product. It's not. We're consultants, because there is no product that the private sector can do there. And data is a public sector good. The public sector can create the incentives for private sector to do it more efficiently. But it needs to fund it, that's a fact. And this takes me to the policies. Now, we've talked about zero-emission vehicles, and we've talked about how we need them. With the climate champions, there is this concept that they say sector breakthrough. They take a sector, they say, what does it need to look like by 2030 to achieve decarbonization? And automotive is one of them. And last year there was the end of ICE engines, and there is very effective work happening on bringing in companies, governments to phase out ICE vehicles and phase in zero-emission vehicles. And that's very important. But that's not enough, because that's half the equation. Because the other equation is, what are we using these vehicles for? How long are we traveling with them? If I had the opportunity to go to my education in a 3-kilometer trip using a bicycle, if I had learned it on time, and now I have a 70-kilometer trip, I will be using a vehicle no matter what, and a lot of energy, even if it is the most efficient Tesla there is. And this takes me to perhaps my final point. We, with the Climate Champions, are now looking for the second breakthrough. And this is really important, because what we don't measure, we don't see. What we don't understand, we don't measure. The end of ICE is simple, it's clear. You can galvanize policymakers behind it. If you write it in the Outlook, people will buy it, and that already happened. Change to electric cars is easy, it makes sense, it's correct, but it's not enough. The other part is complex. It's equity, it is affordability, it is gendered, it is a factor of poverty, multi-dimensional poverty. Can you get it to me in 3 words? End of ICE? And I think that this is, seriously, this is a question I'm dealing with. If somebody has an answer, I would love to hear it. But I think it's just as important, because we need to incorporate the computation and design of justice and equity into our policies, and this is what the model, I think the Outlook also needs to say. It needs to quantify the impacts of these kind of things. To give a very targeted example and end here, you mentioned that in India, trip distances of women are 43% less than men. An insight that we made in Cairo by mapping informal networks was the networks are fantastic for going from home to work, which is exactly the kind of trip that women do far less statistically than men. And they're horrible to get from one place in a city to another place in a city, because it's not where work is in the hub outside. And that means that these systems systematically disadvantage women. But this is a question that only comes from the data science at its best, and it's also a policy design that's very sophisticated to get at, and that needs funding. And by showing what data points the model needs, how these data points affect the outcomes, this is, I think, how this report can help affect policy changing. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Hegazi, for taking us through the comments on the metrics, but also that conversion from the report to how it can inform policy and implementation in the future. So thank you to all of our panelists for those insightful comments. I'd now like to invite any questions from the floor. If you could raise your hand, please. We have one here at the table at the front. This lady here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of your interesting insights, even though I'm not really okay with everything. Kautar Ibn Abdelaziz from GZ Morocco, and I'm just going to point out the one topic on the technology. More like funding the technology. So we are trying to find funds, basically, for the cities to have electric buses. And my question is, why aren't we, because we were talking about equations, so there is a simple equation. We are looking for funding because these buses or these technologies are too expensive. And they are too expensive because there is other technologies who are, at least in the investment, the first investment, like the diesel buses, less expensive than the electric ones. So why don't we simply cut the production of these diesel buses? Why don't Europe oblige the manufacturer to stop producing it and put incentives to not give any technical approval to the other ones coming from Asia, and given other policies to not have the right to sell second-handed diesel buses to other countries. So simply we are not going to have second-hand, very old diesel buses running in Africa. So why aren't we capable today, after it's been 10 years I've been in electric mobility, and in 10 years I didn't see any really improvements. It's only pilot cities everywhere, and in 10 years we are not yet capable of having electric buses everywhere. So this is my question for the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Neil, yeah, please go ahead.
Can I take an attempt at that question? And I hope everyone heard the question. It's why are we not implementing policies that really restrict the sale of diesel buses and really encourage the sale of electric buses? So there's a lot more than just the vehicle itself that's involved in terms of being able to make that transition. We've had quite a challenge in terms of transition in the United States, and we do have the funding to be able to do it. But you have to have the infrastructure in place to be supporting the electric buses as well. You have to have the maintenance staff that are able to maintain electric buses, which is a very different maintenance regime than you have for diesel buses. You have to have the electric grid be able to support the electricity that is needed at the peak times when you're trying to do the recharging as well. So there is a transition that is necessary. Should we be doing it as a priority? Absolutely. Should we be trying to implement the policies to try to make that transition as quickly as we can? But it is a far more complex issue than just saying, well, we should be transitioning to those vehicles. It's more than just a vehicle issue.
I don't know if it directly answers your question, but what they've done in India is they aggregated the demand across multiple cities in India for electric buses. And we have an agency at the center who issued a tender for 5,500 electric buses. What this did is it did two things. It encouraged competition between manufacturers of electric buses. It also signaled to them that there is demand and there is significant demand. And eventually, the final bidder gave a cost, because it was on a gross cost contract, they got a price that was lower than what they were getting at an individual city level. So I think this was one way in which they addressed it. I don't think it directly answers your question, but it just reflects different models of doing this as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sonal. Hegazi. Clarisse. Okay, thank you.
I just would like to complement a little bit what Neil said. You know, we've been working in Brazil to promote the transition. And it was interesting, for example, in Rio de Janeiro, we've been assessing which routes should be the priority for the new vehicles that the city is going to, that the city is purchasing now. So there is a whole movement towards changing the whole regulatory framework. Some cities are breaking the contracts with the current bus providers. So I think it has been quite complex to change the whole system. It is a whole ecosystem. But once we start assessing, for example, which routes should be prioritized, we have many parameters there, including social aspects, right? And then we learn that some of the neighborhoods don't have the grid that is necessary to secure the charging infrastructure that the system would need. So I think you're right. We do need to have a lot of reinforcement and investment from the government. That's not what we see most of the time. And I think in the Brazilian case, we see some discussions at the federal level, but we don't see investment really going on. We see some cities we have 300 electric buses in Brazil, all in pilot projects, the majority in pilot projects. We have one city that managed to have in the concession some specific targets for CO2 abatement and other pollutants abatement, which will result in the long term in the transition of the whole fleet, but this is going to be really long term. So I think if we had a much more like straightforward and heavy investment from the government with good regulation in place, that would be faster. But we are still like slowly, it's very slow. The process is very slow. I agree with you, and it's really frustrating. And I think there are technical issues on that, and the charging infrastructure is one issue that is arising as a hiccup in the process.
Okay, so I'm not a policymaker. I'm not in charge of that, so I cannot answer that question directly. But I can mention something from the Climate Champions and my experience in Egypt and what's happening there. So with the Climate Champions, there is this ZEV campaign, and what it's trying to do is trying to bring in the OEMs, which are the ones that want to do the producing, get them all to agree at the same time to phase out the production, quite similar to what happened in India, but at a global level, so that it does make sense. And not only does it make sense, so that everybody commits to producing only electric from a certain point on, and to push the transition to become faster. So there is work happening on that through the Climate Champions. Now, Egypt. I have worked on 3 strategies on e-mobility in Egypt, and now we're bidding for the 4th as a consultant, and in all of them it comes to the same thing. It doesn't work. Hire me again and again and again, and I'll keep on saying the same things until reality changes. Because electricity is too expensive, gas is too cheap. So in Egypt, and that's very Egyptian, that's regional, it's financially not feasible because of the cost difference between the 2 energy sources, and because the cost of capital is too high. Remember, our interest rates are high. We don't have the same capex benefits that the US has. And it's not economic. And there's a difference between financeable and economic, because a bank, a World Bank can come in and finance it, but it doesn't mean it's the best use of resources. And when you have a city with air pollution killing 25,000 people a year, with diesel quality that is, what was it, 100 times worse than the WHO max or something of the sorts, and you invest in 500 e-buses as opposed to what the government is doing, which is 3,000 natural gas buses, which don't emit particulates, or reduce them by 90%, then it actually, on health measures, on equality measures, on social development and economic development measures, it's the bad use of resources. It's not economic. And this is why it might not be equitable. And I think that the Outlook has a role to play here, because it's also about identifying what affects the outcomes and how does model them show us a better way forward. And this is what we modeled in the terms of implementation of e-buses, specifically in the Egyptian context. And until the prices change, and the government can do that, but I'm not the government, this is where we are. Coming back to the model, can you model adaptation? Can you model resilience of transport systems? Because these are the things that freak me out the most when I'm doing a model. It's the unexpected events. What if you get an above average breakdown of road infrastructure, leading to much higher trip distances than what a typical model would do? And these are the kind of things that we need to identify to make sure that we invest in the most economic investments over the longer run. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that question, a very important one for the real-life context. Are there any further questions? So we have 2 more questions here, please.
Thank you. My name is Andrea Sangil from the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. I have a couple of questions, both based on the measurement part. So the first one is surrounding just regarding data for informal transportation. If you look at countries' NDCs, none of them even appear to address informal transportation or have goals associated to it. And it's pretty much because there's no existing data or official data. If it exists, it's usually supported by international organizations or organizations such as some of the panelists that are here. But there is very little support to have data. And if we don't have those numbers, we won't be able to improve it. And we won't be able to set goals on that. So how would you recommend that we leverage data and mobilize funding to, leverage funding to start generating those data and start generating strategies and goals to incorporate the informal transportation sector that is overwhelmingly a majority of the transportation in the Global South to these discussions? Because if not, we are missing an opportunity to decarbonize a huge part of our transportation in the Global South. And the other element of measurement is how can we bring development banks on board to this as well? The main metric that they use, like in terms of success of the transport development areas that they have, is kilometers of roads built. And if we keep measuring that, we're missing the point completely. And so how can we work with them and bring them on board to change the metrics and based on that, change the strategies and the goals? Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Great questions. And again, we're coming back to metrics, which is an interesting one, I note. So I think perhaps, Sonal, I'll come to you first, if that's okay, because I was impressed by the granularity of the data that you referenced in your initial remarks. So do you have any thoughts in response to that, please?
So, yeah, thank you for asking this question. And I think I have a long answer to this one, but maybe I'll just focus on what you have asked. What we are seeing is that the electrification of vehicles, and particularly commercial vehicles, is being or can be used strategically in order to also reform the sector, right? So what does that mean? And let me give you some specific examples, because we're seeing that in India, where it's not that city governments are coming and saying, you need to transition to an EV and so on. But we are seeing approaches where we recognize that generally they are single operators, rented or owned, very long and precarious working hours, and therefore it's not only about decarbonizing, but also improving their individual health as well. So there is, and this is actually by a bilateral bank, one of which is happening in the North Indian city of Amritsar, where they're using the electrification of the paratransit vehicles to organize the workers, yes, and also see into a cooperative and then see how they can be organized in their services as well, which can also result in improved quality of service by them, because a lot of other things related to rash driving, etc., happen because operators are competing with each other. It doesn't still solve your data problem, but it does solve the problem of vehicle technology as well as health and safety of workers to provide an improved quality of service. We are also seeing this, and maybe another example, perhaps, it must have been covered yesterday in the TUMI session, is in the city of Kochi, where again, the workers have organized into a cooperative, and then happy to kind of elaborate on that better. I think that it's a tough one, right? There are two, in my opinion, there are perhaps some ways in which one can collect data is that you collect data specifically for informal transport through surveys, etc. Another way to do it is through fare integration with public transport, but then we know that is hard and it will take some time. So I don't have a very good answer to your second question.
Thank you. And I would just say, from the point of view of our own data collection exercises, the definition of what you're looking to record also is an important first step. Does anyone else have anything? Neil?
I think you started to answer your first question with your second one, and that is follow the money. And I think what we need to do is the financial institutions need to be demanding that the models that are being developed take into account the informal transportation that is taking place in much of the world. In the United States, where we have far less informal, that type of informal transportation, we actually, our current acting Federal Highway Administrator, who was a professor at Northeastern University, was doing research and found, particularly within the Hispanic immigrant community in the United States, this is the predominant form of transportation, and was recommending we needed to start making changes even within the United States, taking this into account. But I think until the institutions that provide the funding demand that the changes take place in the modeling, it's going to be a challenge.
Malithi, speaking from the perspective of the Outlook itself, do you want to respond to that as well, please?
Yes, I think, is this on? Yes. I think you highlighted a very important challenge. It is something that we take into account in our models, but again, the data is sparse. And so I just wanted to highlight and plug for another session that we are, where we will be talking to development banks and focusing on emerging economies. And so hopefully some of those questions would also be addressed, because I think the focusing on data as opposed to just capital for projects is a very important one. It's at 9 a.m. on Friday, Hall 4. Hope to see many of you there.
Great, thank you very much. Hegazi, off you go. And then just if I can just say, we have another question here. If there are any other questions, there's one at the back, please. Two at the back, sorry. We'll take them together and answer all together. But first we'll hear from Hegazi, please. Thank you, go ahead.
I'll try to be very brief. You work with Benjamin, right? Yes, small world. And indeed, so I just want to highlight some of the things that are happening. So there is like this multilateral push, it's WRI and AFD in particular, platform. It's called Digital Transport for Africa. And it does two things really well. First of all, it tries to create this data by specific data collection campaigns in a lot of cities at the same time. But more importantly, it does exactly what Neil proposed, which is require that every transport investments that these development banks fund include this kind of data collection. And we've done that in Cairo. We've seen it a couple of times. The second thing I want to mention quickly is part of the work that we did in Egypt was use free financing. So it's basically 30,000 euros over a year and a half. Do with it whatever you want. So we're like, okay, let's do a sump visit for a city with 2 million people. Now, this is peanuts for the ambition. There is a 4-step model in it as well, but with 4 zones. So again, it's very simple. But it was helpful because it allowed us to model, even if weekly, the climate impacts of different policy measures and to create the base that didn't exist, because it's the first time that we do modeling in a country like Egypt on a transport intervention level and not national fuel consumption level. To create the basis for what green climate financing requires. And I think that this is something that needs money invested in heavily. And this is something that your Transport Outlook can affect by highlighting the weaknesses in the model and maybe the differences on a per country level in terms of data availability and how they affect the policies or could affect the policies. This is something that needs targeted financing. That's it, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, let's take this question here, please.
Yeah, hi, I'll try and keep it quick as well. So my name's Naomi Barton, I work for the Department for Transport in the UK, and I'm at the moment working on micromobility policy. And my question is about the transition to low-emitting vehicles that I think Neil talked about the most, but you've also touched on everyone else. And we've all talked about how we can increase sustainable access for transport users, but what happens when you take a step back and think about the manufacturing process and the charging process? How can we make that sustainable, and how can we stop these new low-emission vehicles, or how can we stop the old, more polluting vehicles going to countries that maybe don't have a developed electric grid and creating more emissions there? Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you very much. So I think we actually only have one microphone, so my mistake. So we'll deal with that one quickly while the mic is travelling further back in the room, please. Thank you very much. So again, this question of the sort of second and third lives of vehicles. Do you have anything further to add on? No? That's fine. Go ahead, Clarisse.
No, you raise a very important question, and there are a lot of sustainability issues associated, for example, with the mining of all of the rare earth materials that are needed for the batteries for electric vehicles themselves. The whole issue of recycling of batteries, I think, is an area that requires a lot more focus, attention, and research as well. And ultimately, all of this is dependent upon transition of the electric grid to renewable sources for electricity as well. If we don't transition the electric grid, transition to electric vehicles is not going to come anywhere close to what we will require.
Great, thank you. Did you have nothing further to add? Okay, great, thank you. Yes, great, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Kirsten Oschlock. I work for a project called NDC Transport Initiative for Asia. And a lot of the measures which I mentioned here are also things which we highlighted in our flagship report on decarbonized transport in Asia. So please take a look. Also, Sonal and Maliti were one of the main contributors. So it's good to see these synergies. I have 2 questions, one for the Transport Outlook by ITF As in the last COP in Glasgow, there were a lot of mentioning by, for example, China, India, and also Vietnam to have net zero goals quite late, actually. But I would like to ask if they are already reflected in the model you mentioned and the projection for the emissions, or in which model they are already reflected. And my second question, and it's already good to see like this highlighting on data, because we are, of course, for models, you need to have a good amount of data. Like if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. My question is actually to the whole panel. Well, number one, do you know already like how to collect like I don't want to like to call it diverse data, is actually the reality, because the majority of models are based on, when it comes to mobility, on male working from a 9-to-5 job without any additional caretaking responsibilities, which is actually just a minority of the reality, as also Sonal already pointed out. So if you could share maybe already models which can be complex enough to reflect the reality, would be great to know, so that we can include it in our work, as well as how to the best to collect all the data which are also necessary to have a good projection for the reality, how it really looks like. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Good questions. I think maybe on the more technical aspects, we may need to take them offline and discuss after the session. Thank you. Was there a second question? Because this will be the last we hear from the panel. No? Excellent. Okay, great. So we had two questions there. First one, I will go to Malithi in terms of what was taken into account in the last Outlook. And I think timing-wise, that may have been after the last publication. And then the second question was around the highlighting of the quality on data and any recommendations for models that are already doing this better. So Malithi, if you could go first, and then we'll hear from the panel, please.
For sure. Thanks for the question. So we do, this was the Transport Outlook 2021 was published in May last year. So the modeling work was largely completed towards the end of 2020 into the beginning of 2021. So the policy commitments that were considered as part of our recover scenario, the kind of current policy trajectory, was what was promised before the pandemic largely. The promises and the commitments that were made at COP26 and kind of moving forward, these are things that we will be incorporating into the 2023 Outlook that Orla is leading. And so this will, any commitments that have been made will be incorporated into our baseline scenarios so that we understand that to be the current policy trajectory.
Great, thanks Malithi. And then from our panelists quickly, any quick comments on the better data question?
Well, I think you're raising a really important issue, which is which type of data we are collecting, right? In the previous panel, we were talking about data that is disaggregated by gender, by age, by income, by race, right? So if how do we understand the trips, the care-related trips? And so normally caregivers, a woman taking care of kids, and how does that impact the trip patterns? I think this is one of the main demands we have at this point, but also a big challenge at the very local level, right? And governments, they are not, the municipal governments are not, they don't have the infrastructure in place many times to collect this type of data. The data doesn't arrive at a federal level harmonized enough for us to look at the regional or subnational level type of data. So I think this is really one of the main challenges that we have at this point, is how do we understand how different people travel? And I'm not sure that we will manage to understand all the specific ones when we intersect, how the different social markers interact, but this is definitely one of the main demands that we have at this point, and that we hope that the digitalization movement or trends might help us like refine our understanding. And I would love to know what is the modeling that can do that at this point as well. Maybe you can tell.
Sonal, did you have a further comment on that? Or no? No, that's good. So just speaking, to add one final comment from our own perspective, and that level of governance, at the level at which you're collecting and looking to model, is very important. So one of the things we found when trying to do a breakdown in more granular sense of understanding of our data inputs for the model in the last Outlook was that while you might have some granular data for some cities in some regions, you didn't have enough, even cities in one region, to be able to generalize your results to this level of policy recommendations on a global scale. So I think as well, it's not simply about identifying individual best practice, but also about the kind of broadening the scale on which those practices are being deployed. So I abused my position as moderator there to add a final comment, but I'm afraid we are out of time. Oh, you have one final comment, Sonal. Please go ahead.
Sorry, just one thing, because you referred to the NDC-TIA report, and when we looked at the report in the context of Asia, and we did this with a group of prominent civil society individuals in Asia. And we identified some blind spots that were inhibiting action. So while the data is known in whatever form it is, and I think I'll just highlight some of these and kind of talk about what models mean, meaning that, so they highlighted that freight was a blind spot. I think just like this is both urban and non-urban freight. Avoid strategies. Some of the hard, difficult decisions around travel demand management, which would have the highest impact on emissions, were, those were not being adopted. And the third piece was that what do the numbers really mean in our daily lives? And I think that was the first, another big piece that came out was if, for example, we were able to link emissions into how it affects my quality of life and we make it personal, is perhaps it might also be an opportunity to influence action, right? So we do know when we look at air pollution and then you have Beijing and you have Delhi and you have Mexico and you have Paris, and all the cities are implementing measures because we are coming primarily from how we improve our quality of life. So I think I was just kind of also seeing how do we contextualize and personalize numbers that actually talk about our well-being. I think that was my only point.
Excellent, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, although I think this is probably a topic that could run. But the next session are preparing at the back of the hall. So I'd just like to say thank you all for your time. Thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you very much to the technical team working behind the scenes and providing the roving mics and presentations. And a huge thank you to our panellists this morning for a very insightful session and for all of the discussion you brought forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much.